Hello, everyone. Imagine waking up one morning and suddenly realizing that every thought in your head, every desire you feel, and every word you speak was scripted for you by an invisible, pre existing network before you were even born. You suddenly feel that you are not the autonomous author of your life, but merely a temporary character playing out pre written lines on a stage you did not design. Today, we explore this profound epistemological rupture tracing a 50-year intellectual paradigm shift in post-World War II French thought. We will bring together the colliding insights of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, and Michel Foucault. For decades, we have operated under the assumption of humanist agency, the belief that the conscious subject possesses absolute freedom and stands as the master of reality. However, the devastating critiques launched by structuralism and post-structuralism systematically dissolved this subject into unconscious linguistic, anthropological, and historical webs. Our core focus today traces this exact journey, beginning with the humanist heights of existentialism, where human freedom was considered absolute, and moving downward into the inescapable grades of structural determinism, which ultimately culminated in the philosophical declaration of the death of man. This transition was not just a minor academic debate, it was a violent earthquake in the history of ideas. We moved from a philosophy that placed human consciousness at the very center of the universe to a radical perspective that viewed human beings as temporary nodes in vast impersonal matrices of science. But here is the thing we must grapple with. If we are entirely constructed by these linguistic and historical structures, what happens to our individual agency? How do we navigate a world where the rational subject has disintegrated into a matrix of codes? To truly grasp the shock of this 20th century intellectual rupture, we first have to understand the massive philosophical foundation it destroyed. For 300 years, Western philosophy operated under an unquestioned reign. The rational I served as the absolute anchor of all reality. Everything revolved around the human mind. Think about how you interact with the world today. When you set up a customized profile on a new smartphone, the entire digital ecosystem reorganizes itself around your preferences, your location, and your identity. You are the undisputed center. This modern technological narcissism is a direct descendant of Rene Descartes' 17th century realization. I think, therefore I am. Descartes established the cogito, the conscious subject, as the ultimate foundation of indubitable knowledge. Before we can trust the physical world, we must trust our own rational thought. Later, Immanuel Kant expanded this centralized power. Kant argued that the subject is not just a thinker, but an active synthesizer of empirical reality. He posited man as a moral endpoint, asserting that human autonomy is the supreme law of the universe. Then, stepping into the 20th century, Edmund Husserl refined this further with phenomenology. Husserl introduced the concept of intentionality, arguing that consciousness actively directs itself toward objects, effectively validating and sustaining the lived world. In all these models, the subject is the glowing sun, and history, truth, morality, and reality simply orbit around it. For 3 centuries, we were told that human consciousness was an invincible fortress. The subject was the undisputed origin of meaning, the stable core in a chaotic universe. It was a comforting, empowering narrative that gave humanity total dominion over the earth. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, this humanist tradition reached its absolute apotheosis in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. In his 1943 masterpiece, Being and Nothingness, Sartre handed humanity an existential mandate that fundamentally redefined our place in the universe. He declared, quite simply, that existence precedes essence. What does this actually mean in everyday terms? Imagine standing in the aisle of a massive grocery store staring at 100 different types of cereal. There is no divine voice telling you which one to pick, no biological imperative forcing your hand. You have to choose. Sartre scales this anxiety of choice up to the level of human nature itself. He argues that humans exist first, we simply appear. encountering ourselves in the world before we can be defined by any pre-existing concept. Unlike a paper knife, which is designed with a specific essence and purpose before it is manufactured, there is no God-given blueprint for a human being. There is no structural determinism, and there is no inherent human nature waiting to be fulfilled. We are born as an absolute void of potential. Because we lack a predetermined essence, we are forced to define ourselves entirely through our active, deliberate choices. Sartre elevates the human subject to the status of a godlike creator. The subject is a void that violently forces meaning onto a meaningless universe. You are not a product of your environment, your genetics, or your history. You are whatever you decide to become in this exact moment. It is a philosophy of radical, uncompromising agency that places the entire burden of reality squarely on the shoulders of the conscious individual. If we are completely free to shape reality, how exactly does this radical agency function? Sartre explains this through a mechanism he calls nientization or nihilation. Freedom, in the existential framework, is not a passive state of being. It is an active, ontological engine that constantly destroys the static present in order to build the future. To understand this, we have to look at the phenomenological divide between two states of reality, the un soi and the po soi. The un soi, or the in itself, represents inert, massive, meaningless physical reality. Think of a massive block of uncarved marble sitting in a quarry. It just is. It has no awareness, no desires, and no plans. It is completely full of itself. On the other side, we have the po soi, or the for itself. This is human consciousness. Unlike the solid block of marble, human consciousness is essentially a lack, a nothingness. It is defined by what it is not. Because consciousness is a void, it possesses the unique human ability to say no to given reality. This is nihilation. When you look at your current job and decide you want to quit and start a new career, you are engaging in nientization. You are detaching from the physical reality of the present, rejecting the yin soi of your current situation, and projecting an alternative future into existence. You literally introduce nothingness into the world, the realization of what is missing. Therefore, freedom operates as a fierce, active force of destruction and creation. We dismantle the heavy, inert world around us using the power of our conscious nothingness, carving out new pathways for human action. Sartre's vision of absolute freedom might sound incredibly empowering at first glance, but it comes with a terrifying psychological cost. As Sartre famously stated, man is condemned to be free. We must bear the total weight of a world without any structural alibis. Consider a moment when you had to make a life-altering decision, perhaps deciding whether to end a long-term relationship. In that moment of infinite choice, you look around for an excuse. You want to blame your psychology, your upbringing, the economy, or divine will. But existentialism strips all of these comforts away. Without psychological determinism or divine mandates to lean on, the individual has absolutely no external structure to blame for their actions. This leads to what Sartre calls existential anguish or l'angoisse. It is the heavy, suffocating realization that every action you take is a complete, inescapable commitment made on behalf of all humanity. When you choose, you are declaring to the universe, this is how a human being ought to act. Existentialism, therefore, is not a philosophy of joyous optimism or carefree liberation. It emerged from the ashes of a devastated Europe, carrying the terrifying realization that humanity alone was entirely responsible for the horrors of the post-war world. We build the concentration camps, and we build the resistance movements. There is no inherent morality woven into the fabric of the cosmos to save us. We are alone, armed only with our radical agency, facing the crushing anvil of responsibility. If reality is a void, we alone must shoulder the agonizing burden of filling it. While Sartre pushed the concept of the detached, rational subject to its absolute limits, his contemporary Maurice Merleau-Ponty initiated a crucial shift. Merleau-Ponty realized that the existential subject was too isolated, acting as a floating eye that coldly judged the world from a distance. To correct this, he decentered the absolute subject by revealing that human perception is an inescapable physical intertwining. He grounded the mind into the flesh of the lived body. Think about walking down a crowded, bustling city sidewalk during rush hour. You do not consciously calculate the velocity of the pedestrians around you or mathematically plot your trajectory to avoid collisions. Your body simply knows how to weave through the crowd. This is what Merleau-Ponty calls pre-reflective agency. Merleau-Ponty's critique actively dismantles Sartre's purely detached consciousness. He argues that we do not merely possess a body like a pilot steering a mechanical ship, rather, we are our bodies. Human action is fundamentally anchored in physical spatial orientation. When you perceive the world, it is not a passive observation recorded by a detached brain. Perception is an active, physical intertwining with the environment. Your mind cannot be separated from the flesh, the muscles, and the nervous system that encounter the cold wind or the uneven pavement. By dragging the Cartesian subject out of the clouds and forcing it into the muddy, physical reality of the lived body, Merleau-Ponty paved the way for the structuralist critiques that would soon follow. He proved that the subject is not a supreme, isolated master, but an entity deeply biologically tangled in the world. Merleau-Ponty pushes this idea of the lived body even further by introducing the concept of the chiasm, or the intertwining. In this view, consciousness is no longer an invisible ghost haunting a machine. Instead, consciousness is quite literally a fold in the fabric of the universe observing itself. To grasp this bidirectional reality, try a simple physical experiment. Press your right hand against your left hand. In that exact moment, your right hand is the active subject, the seer, touching an object. But simultaneously, your left hand is the passive object, the seen, being touched. In a split second, the roles reverse. You are both touching and being touched. This is the chiasm. The subject is not a detached observer peering into a foreign universe from the outside, safely hidden behind a wall of glass. The subject is made of the exact same flesh as the surrounding world. Just as your hands intertwine, human consciousness is completely continuous with the reality it perceives. When you look at a majestic mountain, you are not just a mind registering visual data. You are a piece of the world folding back on itself to admire its own geography. The absolute boundary of the Cartesian ego completely dissolves here. You do not end where your skin begins, and the world does not start where your skin ends. By exposing this deep physical continuity, Merleau-Ponty fatally weakened the idea of an autonomous, isolated subject, setting the stage for the structuralists to expose the invisible grids that govern this interconnected flesh. If Merleau-Ponty tied the subject to the physical body, Ferdinand de Saussure trapped it inside the invisible cage of language. This marks the beginning of the structuralist shockwave, a massive epistemological earthquake that fundamentally altered French thought. The radical realization was this: the subject does not speak language, rather, language speaks the subject. Imagine you experience a profound, unprecedented moment of heartbreak. You feel a pain so unique that you believe no one in history has ever felt it. But the moment you try to express this pain, you are forced to use pre-existing English grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. You reach for words that were invented by people who have been dead for centuries. This is what Saussure proved with his structural linguistics. He demonstrated that language, or la langue, is an overarching, pre-existing, synchronous system of rules. It is not a passive tool wielded by a conscious, masterful subject to name reality. It is a rigid grid that exists long before the individual is born, and it rigidly dictates exactly how the individual is capable of thinking. This completely destroys Sartre's idea of absolute freedom. You cannot shape reality from scratch if the very concepts you use to think about reality were programmed into you by a cultural matrix. we prioritize synchrony over agency. The structure of the language predetermines the boundaries of human thought. The conscious subject is no longer the center of the universe. It is merely a node caught in a massive, inescapable linguistic web. Saussure did not just trap the subject in language. He stripped the conscious subject of the power to assign ultimate meaning. For centuries, we believed in a natural, almost divinely ordained link between a word and the physical thing it described. Saussure dismantled this illusion by splitting the sign into two parts: the signifier, which is the acoustic sound or visual mark, and the signified, which is the mental concept. He revealed the arbitrary nature of the sign. There is absolutely no natural reason why the sound tree should represent a tall wooden plant with leaves. The link is entirely mechanical and arbitrary. If the link is arbitrary, how do words mean anything at all? Saussure argued that meaning is generated mechanically through negative difference within the closed structural differential network. A word only holds meaning based on its structural difference from other words in the system. For instance, the word cat means cat only because it mechanically differs from bat, hat, or mat. It has no inherent positive value of its own. But here is the devastating philosophical consequence. If meaning is generated purely by negative differences within a closed, pre-existing system, then meaning is not generated by human intent or external reality. When you speak, you are just triggering mechanical differences in a vast engine of signs. The humanist subject is effectively removed from the driver's seat of reality, reduced to a mere operator, pulling levers in a linguistic machine that runs entirely on its own mathematical logic. The structuralist earthquake did not stop at linguistics. Claude Lévi-Strauss controversially exported Saussure's linguistic grids directly into human anthropology, effectively redefining how we understand culture itself. He set out to prove that human culture operates with the exact same blind, mechanical precision as grammar. Before Lévi-Strauss, we tended to view primitive myths, incest taboos, and marriage rules as the conscious, deliberate inventions of ancient human societies, perhaps created for moral reasons or social harmony. Lévi-Strauss shattered this humanist illusion with his analysis of the elementary structures of kinship. He argued that these cultural artifacts are not conscious, artistic, or moral inventions at all. Instead, culture is the unconscious binary output of the human brain's natural biological tendency to organize the world into binary structures. Think of a computer processing complex software using only ones and zeros. Lévi-Strauss suggested the human mind does exactly the same thing. When a primitive tribe establishes complex rules about who can marry whom, they are not acting out of conscious agency or ethical wisdom. They are simply executing an underlying mathematical logic of nature. The kinship structures operate independently of conscious human intent, distributing genetic material and social bonds through a closed system of differences, just like vowels and consonants in a language. Lévi-Strauss effectively stripped humanity of its creative authorship, reducing the grand tapestry of human culture to an unconscious biological calculator generating structural permutations. To fully grasp how thoroughly Lévi-Strauss erased the humanist illusion of creative genius, we must look at how these invisible structural matrices govern everyday life. Humanity's most basic cultural activities are strictly dictated by unconscious binary oppositions. We are constantly navigating axes of opposition, like nature versus culture, or the raw versus the cooked. Consider a modern weekend barbecue. When you take a raw piece of meat and apply fire to it to roast it, you feel like you are just making dinner. But culturally, you are executing a mathematical transformation. You are moving an object from the realm of nature, the raw, to the realm of culture, the cooked, via the transformative medium of fire. If the meat decays, it moves to the rotted, the natural transformation. Lévi-Strauss applied this exact same matrix to human mythology. He proved that variations in cultural myths, art, and daily practices are merely mathematical transformations of these underlying binaries. This leads to his most famous chilling declaration: myths think themselves through men without their knowing. You are not inventing a story. The structural grid is using your brain to permute its own variables. The concept of the individual creative author is completely erased. Human behavior is bounded by these rigid, invisible geometric grids. Whether we are telling a bedtime story or cooking a meal, we are not acting out of radical freedom. We are unconsciously plotting points on an anthropological graph. By the 1960s, these two massive forces, the humanist heights of existentialism and the devastating critiques of structuralism, collided in the ultimate ideological debate of 20th century French philosophy. It was a direct clash between Jean-Paul Sartre and Claude Lévi-Strauss. Sartre championed existentialism, desperately holding on to a teleological view of history. He believed humanity was marching progressively toward a goal driven by absolute free will, dialectical action, and nihilation. Sartre focused on the conscious future, insisting that human agency actively shapes reality. Levi-Strauss, armed with structural determinism, looked at the exact same world and saw a discontinuous history. To him, history had no ultimate direction. It was merely a series of static underlying structures shifting mechanically. The human subject was not a heroic agent, but a temporary node, executing unconscious rules through synchronous binary oppositions. Levi-Strauss focused on enduring systems and the unconscious myths that control us. The aftermath of this debate was devastating for the humanist camp. Levi-Strauss's relentless critique successfully dismantled the golden arrow of historical progress. He proved that the existentialist dream of total freedom was merely a modern myth, a specific, temporary historical episteme masquerading as a universal human truth. The conscious subject was decisively dethroned, and structuralism proved that we are woven into webs far older and far more powerful than our own individual will. As the structuralist grid locked down anthropology, Jacques Lacan weaponized structural linguistics to assassinate the rational ego of Freud's psychoanalysis. Before Lacan, we often imagined the Freudian unconscious as a chaotic, boiling pot of primal animal instincts, a dark biological basement of untamed urges fighting against the rational ego. Lacan erased this biological and humanist remnant entirely. He declared a radical subversion. The unconscious is not a pit of animal instinct, it is a highly structured linguistic machine. The unconscious is structured exactly like a language, operating through mechanical processes of metaphor, condensation, and metonymy displacement. But Lacan's most devastating blow to the concept of human agency was his assertion regarding the discourse of the other. If the unconscious is a linguistic matrix, then the conscious I is entirely decentered. Human desire is completely mediated through societal symbols and external linguistic structures. Think about why you might passionately desire to own a luxury watch. It is not a primal biological instinct to tell time. You desire the watch because the cultural structure has programmed you to recognize it as a symbol of status and power. You only desire what the system tells you to desire. The rational, independent ego is a myth. Our deepest, most intimate wants are actually dictated by the discourse of the other, proving that we are trapped in the web, even at the level of our own psychology. If our deepest desires are programmed by the other, how do we ever develop a sense of self? Lacan answers this with his famous concept of the mirror stage, or stade du miroir, revealing that the subject is an alienating armor born entirely out of illusion. Between the ages of 6 and 18 months, a human infant is physically uncoordinated, experiencing its body as a fragmented, helpless mass. But when this infant looks into a mirror, it sees a unified, complete reflection. The infant experiences a moment of reconnaissance or misrecognition. It looks at this flawless visual projection, the ideal I, and mistakenly assumes that perfect image is my true self. This optical illusion is the birthplace of the human ego. The fiction of the human ego is an imaginary construct born to hide our fundamental helplessness. We spend the rest of our lives chasing this impossible wholeness, trying to live up to a mirage in the glass. This creates the symbolic trap. The human is permanently trapped inside Lacan's Borromean knot of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic orders. The subject is forever alienated from its own reality, wearing the ego like a suit of armor that does not quite fit. The rational, masterful subject celebrated by Descartes is exposed here as a tragic, fictional character, forever chasing its own shadow in a hall of mirrors. As psychoanalysis dissolved the ego, Michel Foucault launched a historical deconstruction that attacked the very concept of humanity. Foucault violently rejected the myth of historical permanence. We tend to believe that human nature is a constant, steady thread running unbroken from ancient Greece to the modern day. Foucault's archaeology of knowledge proved this to be false. Historical truth is not a progressive march of human discovery. It is a product of shifting, unconscious grids of knowledge called epistemes. An episteme is the unconscious set of rules of a specific era that strictly dictates what can even be thought. Foucault analyzed the transition between epistemes, the Renaissance era of resemblance, the classical era of representation, and the modern era. His devastating conclusion was that the concept of the human subject, the autonomous, rational man, did not exist in antiquity or the classical age. Man is a fragile, recent invention of the 18th and 19th centuries. The human subject was fabricated specifically by modern sciences to categorize and manage populations. When you fill out a demographic survey or take a standardized personality test today, you are participating in a historical construct that is barely 200 years old. Foucault proved that the humanist subject is not the eternal anchor of reality, but a temporary byproduct of shifting discursive grids. Foucault did not merely expose man as a recent invention. He revealed the dark, oppressive machinery behind this invention. We generally view the rise of disciplines like biology, philology, psychology, and economics as a triumphant humanist pursuit of knowing oneself. We celebrate the Enlightenment for freeing us from ignorance. Foucault flips this narrative completely. The human subject is not a liberated agent basking in the light of scientific progress. We are, in fact, prisoners of knowledge. These human sciences were born strictly out of a need to serve institutional power. They were designed to observe, categorize, and control populations. Think about a standard performance review at a corporate job. You are endlessly analyzed, your productivity is tabulated, and your personality is measured against a baseline of normalcy. By making man an object of scientific study, the modern subject is disciplined and normalized. We internalize this self-surveillance. The humanist pursuit of psychology does not free your mind. It categorizes your behaviors into healthy and deviant, providing institutional power with the alibi it needs to manage you. Humanism, in Foucault's archaeology, is merely the dark side of a power knowledge dynamic. The subject was only invented so that it could be measured, tracked, and chained to the disciplinary grid. This relentless deconstruction leads us to the radical climax of post-World War II French philosophy, Michel Foucault's ultimate declaration of the death of man. If the humanist subject is merely a recent invention engineered by the specific episteme of the 19th century, then it is bound by the laws of history. It has a beginning, and inevitably it will have an end. The humanist subject is exposed as a fleeting anomaly. In his masterpiece, The Order of Things, Foucault predicts that as our current episteme shifts once again moving heavily toward systems, cybernetics, and linguistic structures, the very concept of man is destined to be erased entirely. To capture this haunting inevitability, Foucault uses one of the most famous images in modern philosophy. The humanist subject is like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. As the tide of shifting discursive formations rolls in, the face is quietly and indifferently washed away. We are already witnessing this erasure today. As we become increasingly defined by algorithmic data profiles, biometric surveillance, and interconnected digital grids, the autonomous freewheeling subject of Sartre's existentialism fades into irrelevance. The grades of knowledge that invented us are now mutating, preparing to leave the concept of humanity behind in the sands of history. The dissolution of the subject naturally bled from philosophy into literature. If the human subject is dead, what happens to the creator of a text? Roland Barthes answered this by severing the ultimate theological authority in literature, proclaiming the death of the author. Classically, we treated the author as a god. We believed the text was a static object containing a single hidden message, and the author was the singular source of that meaning. To understand a book, we obsessively studied the author's life and intentions. Barthes dismantles this author god entirely. The creator is reduced to a mere scripter. A scripter does not originate brilliant, organic meaning from within a masterful soul. They merely mix and compile pre-existing signs and cultural codes. A text is not a straight line of words releasing a single message. Instead, it is a multidimensional space where a variety of writings blend, clash, and echo. Think of a viral social media post. The moment it goes online, the original creator suffers a total loss of control. The dead subject manifests in literature. The author loses ultimate authority over their own work because the text immediately enters a web of cultural references. The scripter simply weaves the fabric. They do not own the meaning that the fabric ultimately generates. If the author is dead and cannot dictate the meaning of a text, where does meaning come from? Julia Kristeva and Roland Barthes answer this by relocating meaning to the infinite play of the network, introducing the concept of intertextuality. Every text is essentially a mosaic of quotations. When you read a modern novel, you are not absorbing a wholly original creation. You are navigating an absorption and transformation of countless other texts, histories, and societal codes. Because meaning is an infinite play of signs referring only to other signs, meaning can never be permanently fixed by a creator. Therefore, the birth of the reader must come at the cost of the death of the author. Meaning is dynamically generated within the reader. You, the reader, become a temporary intersection of signs. When you read a book, your unique cultural background, your current mood, and your memory of other books violently collide with the text on the page. You reconstruct the text. Meaning is not locked in the creator's past intention. It is a fluid, active event happening inside the grid of the reader's mind. The subject is decentered. Once again, neither the author nor the reader owns the text. They are merely nodes where the vast intertextual web temporarily vibrates with meaning. As we stand at the end of this 50-year intellectual paradigm shift, we are confronted by a resulting deadlock in modern philosophical thought. We face a profound dialectical tension. Can moral agency actually survive the structural web? On one side, we have existentialism's demand. In the wake of horrific historical atrocities like the Second World War, there is a desperate, burning need for human responsibility, active choice, and moral accountability. We need the subject to be free so we can hold the individuals accountable for evil. On the other side, we have post-structuralism's proof. Decades of rigorous philosophy, anthropology, and linguistics have exposed inescapable matrices of determinism, proving that our language, our deepest desires, and our cultures are rigidly programmed by external systems. This leaves us in a permanent state of friction. If we are completely constructed by linguistic, historical, and psychological webs, how can we possibly be held responsible for our actions? Yet, if we simply ignore the systems that program us to preserve our morality, we fall back into the naive, dangerous illusion of absolute mastery. The synthesis here is not a peaceful resolution. We are forced to live inside this contradiction, balancing the absolute necessity of moral justice against the undeniable reality of our structural programming. We have traced the disintegration of the Cartesian master into the subjectless web of structures. The blueprint is definitively dissolved, but something remains. The subject, as an absolute, centralized ruler of the universe, is permanently dead, yet we still must act. The modern subject survives, but it survives as a decentralized, fractured, and culturally constructed entity. Agency today is no longer about possessing the absolute freedom to shape reality from scratch. We cannot step outside the matrix of language or historical epistemes. True modern agency is tactical awareness. It is about understanding the massive, invisible, structural webs we are caught in and finding brief, localized moments of resistance and recreation from within the grid. As we look toward an era increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and algorithmic determinism, this French critique is more vital than ever. AI perfectly embodies the structuralist web, a closed system of pre existing data dictating our choices, predicting our desires, and categorizing our lives. Our challenge is to locate our fractured humanity within this digital grid, exercising tactical resistance in a world where the code speaks the subject. That concludes our exploration for today. Thank you for your time and see you next time.